It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I walked into Westlake Medical Center for my annual checkup. The air smelled of antiseptic and coffee, and the walls had that cold, spotless white that always made me a little uneasy. I had been coming to this clinic for years, ever since my husband, Richard, and I moved to Seattle after retiring. At 68. I like to think I was doing pretty well for my age. My doctor said my blood pressure was steady, my heart strong. I took my vitamins, walked every morning, and tried to laugh as much as I could. Life was simple, predictably, and I liked it that way. Richard was waiting in the car while I checked in. He hated hospitals. He always said the smell reminded him of loss. I smiled when I thought of that. We had lost people. Sure. But we had also survived so much together. Or at least that's what I believed back then. When the nurse called my name, I stood and followed her into the examination room. She was new, younger than most of the nurses I'd seen there before. Her name tag said Emily. She had kind eyes, but her smile didn't quite reach them. Mrs. Hayes. Right? She asked softly while checking her clipboard. Yes. Eleanor Hayes, I said, sitting on the exam table. She took my vitals, asked me the usual questions, and tried to make small talk about the weather. Everything seemed normal, but there was something in the way she kept glancing toward the door that made me uneasy. When Dr. Klein came in, he did the regular routine, listened to my chest, asked about my sleep, my appetite, my energy. Then he nodded and said everything looked great. I felt a small wave of relief. As he left, Emily stayed behind, saying she needed to double-check a few things in the computer. I smiled politely, ready to grab my purse and go. That's when she stepped closer. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed me my coat. Something small and folded slipped into my palm at the same time. She leaned forward, whispering barely loud enough for me to hear. Please read this later. Not here. I blinked, confused. But before I could ask anything, she was already moving toward the door. Her face had gone pale. Thank you, I said automatically, and she nodded without looking at me. I put the folded paper in my coat pocket and walked out to the lobby. My heart was beating faster than it should have. Richard was parked right by the entrance, smiling through the windshield. He rolled down the window. Everything all right? He asked. All good, I said, forcing a smile. Just a regular checkup. Good, he said, taking my hand as I got in. His hand was warm, strong, familiar. Yet, for some reason, it felt different that day. We drove home in silence. Normally, he'd talk about what he wanted for dinner or complain about Seattle traffic. But that morning, he said nothing. The radio played some old Sinatra tune, and I stared out the window, trying to ignore the weight of that little folded note burning in my pocket. When we reached home, he carried in the grocery bags we'd bought earlier. Humming softly, I told him I was tired and wanted to rest. He kissed my forehead, said he'd start dinner later, and went to his study. I stood in the kitchen, waiting until I heard his office door close. Only then did I pull out the paper. It was a small piece of hospital stationery, folded neatly in half. My fingers trembled as I opened it. He's not your husband. That was all it said. 4 words, written in hurried, uneven handwriting. For a moment, I just stared at it. Then I laughed quietly to myself. That's ridiculous, I whispered, shaking my head. Maybe she gave me the wrong note. Maybe it was meant for someone else. I walked to the living room window. The rain had started again, tapping lightly against the glass. Richard's car keys were on the counter, his jacket draped over the chair. The same as always. On the wall hung the framed photo from our wedding in Maui 8 years ago. He looked handsome in that white shirt, smiling at me like I was the only woman in the world. How could that man not be my husband? But as I looked closer at the photo, something twisted in my stomach. His smile in that picture seemed different from the one he gave me now. Warmer. Maybe. Realer. I shook my head again. I was being silly. Probably just tired. Overthinking things. Emily must have confused me with another patient. When Richard came into the room, I quickly tucked the note into my pocket. "You look pale," he said. "Everything okay, just tired." I murmured. "The doctor said I'm fine." He studied my face for a moment longer than usual. Then smiled. "Good. I'll make us tea." As he walked into the kitchen, I noticed the faintest hesitation in his step, like he was thinking about something else entirely. That night, I couldn't sleep. Richard was snoring softly beside me, his hand resting on my shoulder like always. Normally, that comforted me. But now, it felt heavy. I turned toward the window, listening to the rain. What if Emily hadn't made a mistake? What if there was something I didn't know, at 2 a.m? I got up quietly, careful not to wake him. I went to the kitchen, made tea, and sat at the table, staring at the note again. I thought about Emily's pale face, her trembling hands. She had looked genuinely frightened. Why would a stranger risk her job to tell me something like that if it wasn't true? The refrigerator hummed softly behind me. I looked at the small stack of bills on the counter. Electricity, phone, insurance, all in Richard's name. Mine was nowhere on them. That wasn't unusual. He handled most of our finances. Still, a small unease crept up my spine. Around 3, I heard footsteps. Richard walked in, half asleep, rubbing his eyes. "You're up," he said, with a sleepy smile. "Couldn't rest, just couldn't sleep." I said. He came closer, looked down at the note on the table, and for a second, I saw something flicker in his eyes. His expression softened again almost immediately. "What's that, oh?" "Nothing," I said quickly, folding it back up. "Just some health reminder from the clinic." He nodded slowly, though I could tell he didn't believe me. Then he took my cup, set it in the sink, and said, "Come back to bed. It's late." I followed him, but my chest felt tight. When I lay back down, I waited until his breathing grew steady again. Then I turned on my side and watched him sleep. In the dim light, his face looked calm. Innocent, almost. The man I had trusted for nearly a decade. The man I thought I knew. But the words kept echoing in my mind like a whisper I couldn't silence. "He's not your husband." When morning came, I felt as if I hadn't slept at all. I made breakfast as usual. Scrambled eggs and toast. Poured him coffee. And tried to pretend everything was fine. But when he kissed my cheek before leaving for the day, a chill ran through me. As the door closed, I sat at the table, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee he had left behind. I picked up the phone and dialed Westlake Medical Center. When the receptionist answered, I asked to speak with Nurse Emily. "I'm sorry," the woman said. "There's no one by that name working here." I froze. "Maybe you have the wrong department." I said, "She helped Dr. Klein yesterday." "I'm sure." "Ma'am." The receptionist replied politely. "There's no Emily on staff here." I hung up slowly. The silence in the house was suffocating. That was the first moment I truly felt it. Something was terribly, impossibly wrong. I sat frozen at the kitchen table, the dial tone still buzzing in my ear. My hand shook as I set the phone down. No Emily. No record. Nothing. The woman who had warned me didn't exist. I told myself it had to be a mix-up. That maybe she was a temp nurse or a student shadowing the doctor. Still, the unease in my chest felt heavier than before. I looked around the kitchen, at the sunlight filtering through the curtains, at the framed photos of Richard and me from our trip to Vancouver. Everything looked perfectly normal. But it all felt like a stage set. A carefully arranged illusion. I decided to distract myself with chores. The mail had just arrived. A neat stack in the mailbox. I sorted through it: utility bills. A magazine. A letter addressed to Richard from a law firm in Portland. He usually opened everything right away. So I set it aside. But the bold black letters caught my eye. I stared at the return address for a long time before curiosity won. I slid my finger under the flap and unfolded the papers. It was an account statement. The name printed at the top was Richard Coleman. Guardian account for E. Hayes. My stomach tightened. I read the line twice. Then a third time. As if repetition could change what I saw. Guardian account. My name. But not my signature. Not my handwriting either. I put the papers back, careful to fold them exactly as they were. My hands were slick with sweat. When Richard got home that evening, I pretended nothing had happened. He asked about my day. And I smiled and said I'd watered the plants and watched an old movie on TV. He kissed the top of my head and said, "Good. You need to rest more." But as he turned away, I noticed a faint smudge of ink on his sleeve. The same deep blue as the letterhead I'd seen that morning. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I replayed the nurse's trembling voice. The missing record. The word guardian echoing in my mind. I barely slept. And when I did, I dreamed of signing papers I didn't understand while Richard smiled beside me. The next morning, I decided to test something. Over breakfast, I said casually, "I've been thinking about updating my will. Just to keep things in order. Maybe we should see a lawyer together next week." He didn't look up from his newspaper. "There's no rush," he said. "We already have everything set up." I asked softly. He glanced up then, his eyes narrowing for just a second before softening again. "Of course. You worry too much. Ellie." He used that nickname only when he wanted to end a conversation. I nodded and forced a small laugh, pretending to agree. Later that afternoon, when he went to pick up groceries, I went into his office. It was something I'd never done before. He always kept it locked. But lately, he'd been careless. And the key sat right there on his dresser. I hesitated for a full minute before using it. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and cologne. His desk was immaculate. Everything in perfect order. I opened the top drawer and found neatly organized folders. Most were ordinary. Bills and insurance papers. But one was labeled legal. I opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of documents I'd never seen: property deeds, financial statements, and another guardian form listing him as my legal representative. My birth date was correct, but the signature wasn't mine. I stared at it. The shaky, uneven handwriting that looked almost childlike. It was an imitation. I put the papers back quickly, my heart pounding so loud it filled my ears. When I turned around, I caught my reflection in the dark computer screen. I looked older than I remembered. Tired. Frightened. The sound of the garage door opening made my blood run cold. I locked the drawer, replaced the key, and hurried out. Sitting on the couch just as Richard walked in. "You all right?" he asked, dropping the grocery bags on the counter. "Fine," I said too quickly. He studied me for a moment, then smiled. "Good. I picked up that herbal tea you like. It'll help you sleep." That night, I stared at the steaming cup he handed me. It smelled faintly different, more bitter than usual. I waited until he turned off the light, then poured it into the sink. The next morning, I told him it had helped, that I'd slept like a baby. He seemed pleased, almost relieved. For the rest of the week, I pretended to be the perfect wife. I cooked his favorite meals, laughed at his jokes, even watched that silly crime show he loved. But inside, I was unraveling. I watched everything, memorizing details the way he hid envelopes in his briefcase, how he turned the laptop away from me whenever I walked by. Friday morning. I followed him when he left the house. I told him I was going to meet a friend for lunch. But instead, I trailed behind his car, keeping my distance. He drove across town to a small office building in Bellevue. The sign outside said Evergreen Estate Management. I parked across the street and waited. 40 minutes later, he came out carrying a brown envelope and shaking hands with a man in a suit. I wrote down the name on the building, then drove home before he did. My hands trembled the entire time, but a strange calm had settled over me too. I wasn't crazy. Something was happening. And I needed proof. When he returned that afternoon, he was cheerful, humming a tune as he took off his coat. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice light. "Perfect day," he said, smiling. I smiled back, even as my pulse raced. That night, after he fell asleep, I went to his office again. This time, I plugged a small flash drive into his laptop, something my son had given me years ago for storing family photos. I copied every file that mentioned my name. It took nearly an hour, but I got everything. When it finished, I tucked the flash drive into my pocket and went to bed, pretending to be half asleep when Richard stirred beside me. He brushed my arm, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The next morning, I drove to the library and used one of their computers to look up Evergreen Estate Management. What I found made my skin crawl. It was a shell company used in several fraud investigations across the state, though no one had ever been convicted. I printed the web page and slipped it into my purse. When I got home, Richard was sitting in the living room, watching TV. He muted it as soon as I walked in. "Where were you?" he asked casually. "Just went for a walk," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded but didn't look convinced. His eyes lingered on my purse for a moment before turning back to the screen. That night, while washing dishes, I caught my reflection again in the kitchen window. The woman staring back looked nothing like the one from our wedding photo. Her eyes were sharp, focused, alive with fear, but also something else. Determination. I wiped my hands and sat down at the table. The note from the nurse was still tucked inside my wallet, edges worn from being handled too much. I unfolded it again, tracing the words with my finger. "He's not your husband." I whispered them softly, tasting the weight of each syllable. By the time the clock struck midnight, I had made up my mind. Tomorrow, I was going back to Westlake Medical Center. If that nurse had vanished, someone there had to know why. And this time, I wouldn't leave without answers. The next morning, I parked outside Westlake Medical Center with my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The sky was gray, the kind of color that makes you want to stay in bed. But I had no choice. I needed to find Emily. I walked through the automatic doors, trying to look casual even though my hands were trembling. The receptionist from before looked up and smiled politely. "Back again." "Mrs. Hayes?" she asked. "Yes," I said, forcing a calm tone. "I was here a few days ago for an appointment with Dr. Klein. I need to speak with one of the nurses." "Emily." She frowned, typing something into the computer. "I told you yesterday." "Ma'am, we don't have an Emily on staff here." I leaned forward slightly. "Are you sure?" She was young, maybe late 20s. Brown hair, blue scrubs. She was helping Dr. Klein in exam room 3. The receptionist looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry." "Ma'am, maybe you mean Emma or Amelia." "No," I said quietly. "It was Emily." She shook her head, glancing toward a security camera on the wall. I could tell she wanted me to drop it. I turned away, pretending to leave. But instead of walking out the front door, I slipped into the hallway that led to the exam rooms. My pulse raced. I remembered exactly where I'd been that day. The sterile smell. The faint hum of machines. Exam room 3 was at the end. I reached for the handle. But it was locked. Behind me, I heard footsteps. A nurse in green scrubs stopped. "Ma'am. Can I help you?" I froze. "I was just looking for Emily," I said. "She helped me with my appointment last week." Her expression changed. Her voice softened. "Mrs. Hayes, could you come with me for a moment?" She led me into a small supply room. My palms were sweating. "I shouldn't be doing this," she whispered. "But I know who you're talking about." "You do," she nodded. "Emily Carter. She was here for a temporary assignment. She left suddenly 2 days ago. Didn't even pick up her last paycheck." "Why?" I asked. The woman hesitated. "Look, I'm not supposed to talk about this. But there was some kind of trouble. Someone said she was asking questions about patient files. The administration let her go." My stomach twisted. "Did she say anything about me, about my husband?" The nurse bit her lip. "She just said to be careful. That's all." I gripped the counter to steady myself. "Thank you," I whispered. When I stepped out into the parking lot, the wind had picked up. I sat in my car, shaking, staring at the steering wheel. Emily had been fired for helping me. She'd risked her job to warn me. And now she was gone. I couldn't go home yet. I needed to think. So I drove to a coffee shop near the lake and sat by the window with a cup of black coffee I didn't even taste. I pulled out my phone and typed, "Emily Carter, Seattle Westlake Medical." A few results came up. Mostly LinkedIn pages. Nothing helpful. Then one article caught my eye. A local news piece about a nurse whistleblower in Oregon 3 years ago. A woman named Emily Carter had exposed a case of insurance fraud involving patient records. No photo. But the age and location matched. My heart jumped. I scrolled to the end of the article. It mentioned the suspect in that case had never been caught. His name was David Reynolds. I read the name twice before the air left my lungs. David Reynolds. The same name I'd seen on one of the fake documents in Richard's desk. It felt like the world tilted under me. I grabbed my purse and left. My coffee still half full on the table. The drive home felt endless. The whole way. I rehearsed what I'd say if Richard asked where I'd been. When I pulled into the driveway, his car was already there. My heart sank. I took a deep breath, forced a smile, and walked in. "Hey, you're home early," I said. He turned from the kitchen, his face perfectly calm. "Just felt like having lunch here." "You disappeared this morning." I shrugged. "Went for a walk by the lake. Needed air." He studied me for a moment, then nodded. "You've been restless lately." "Everything okay, fine," I said too quickly. "Just tired." He smiled. But there was something behind it. Something cold. After lunch, he went into his study and closed the door. I waited a few minutes, then slipped out the back door, my phone in hand. I called Clara, my old friend from college who worked at Rainier Trust Bank. "Clara, it's Eleanor. I need a favor." "Anything," she said. "What's going on?" "I need you to check something for me." Quietly. A marriage record for Richard Coleman and me. From 2016. And maybe any financial accounts under my name. There was a pause. "You sound serious." "I am," I said. "Please." She sighed. "Give me an hour." When she called back, I stepped out onto the porch so Richard wouldn't hear. "Eleanor," she said. "I don't know how to tell you this. There's no marriage record under that name in Washington." My throat went dry. None. And about the accounts, there are several under your name. But they're all marked as managed by a guardian. I closed my eyes. "Clara." "Who's listed as the guardian?" A pause. "Richard Coleman." I felt dizzy. My knees almost gave out. Clara's voice softened. Eleanor, are you safe? I don't know. I whispered. Do you want me to call the police? No. Not yet. I need proof first. Be careful, she said. I hung up and went back inside. Richard was in the living room. Reading. He looked up. Everything all right? Yes, I said with a smile that felt like glass cracking. He patted the seat next to him. Sit with me. I sat down. Heart pounding. He reached for my hand. His thumb brushing my skin. His touch used to feel comforting. Now, it felt like a trap. You've been quiet lately, he said softly. Just tired, I repeated. He smiled again. That same charming smile that had once made me fall in love. The one that now terrified me. That night, I lay awake, listening to his breathing beside me. I thought about Emily. About Clara. About the word guardian written beside my name. I thought about David Reynolds and the article that said he had vanished years ago. The pieces were fitting together, and the picture they made was horrifying. In the morning, I went back to the office where Richard kept his files. The drawer was locked again. This time I didn't hesitate. I used a small screwdriver from the garage to pry it open. My hands shook, but I managed. Inside, among the folders, was a small black notebook. I flipped it open and froze. Inside were names, dates, places, women. Each one had a note beside it: assets, location, resolved. At the bottom of the page was my name. Next to it, the words, final transfer pending. I dropped the notebook and stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The front door opened just then, and I heard his voice calling from the hallway. Ellie. I slammed the drawer shut, locked it, and shoved the screwdriver into my pocket. In here, I called out, forcing calm into my voice. He walked in holding a grocery bag, smiling like always. You scared me, he said. You look like you saw a ghost. Maybe I did, I murmured, my voice barely steady. He chuckled, not catching the edge in my tone. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I watched the clock tick past midnight. Then 2. Then 4. I knew now that Emily's warning had been real. The man sleeping next to me wasn't my husband. He was something far worse. The sun was just rising when I packed a small tote bag and drove toward downtown Seattle. I didn't even tell Richard I was leaving. He was still asleep. And for once, I was grateful for his heavy snoring. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. But I knew exactly where I was going. Clara had risked enough over the phone. I needed to see her in person. Her office at Rainier Trust Bank was quiet. The kind of sterile calm that made me feel out of place. She met me in the lobby. Her expression tight but kind. Eleanor, she said softly, pulling me into her office and closing the door. Tell me what's going on. I told her everything. The note from the nurse, the fake records, the names in the black notebook. As I spoke, her face went pale. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This isn't just fraud, Ellie, she said. This is criminal. He's using your identity, your money, your trust. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. Can you find out how much he's taken? She turned to her computer. It might take a few minutes. I sat there, twisting my wedding ring, staring at my reflection in the glass window. Outside, people walked to work, carrying coffee cups, talking on phones, living ordinary lives. I felt like I had fallen into a different world. After 10 minutes, Clara's fingers stopped typing. She looked up, her voice low. He's already moved most of your retirement savings into an account under that Evergreen Estate Company. About $200,000. My chest tightened. 200,000. That was my entire nest egg. The money I'd saved since my first marriage. I felt sick. Can we stop him? I whispered. Clara hesitated. We can try. But he's listed as guardian on every document. It looks legal. At least on paper. You'd need evidence to prove forgery. I swallowed hard. Then I'll get it. Clara reached across the desk, taking my hand. Be careful. Ellie. Men like this don't stop when they're cornered. I squeezed her hand back. I won't let him win. When I left the bank, the city looked sharper somehow. Every sound felt louder. Every face unfamiliar. I drove home in silence, rehearsing excuses in case Richard asked where I'd been. When I walked through the door, he was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee. His briefcase was open beside him. Morning, he said easily. You're up early. I smiled faintly. Just ran a few errands. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on my bag. You've been restless lately, he said. Maybe we should take a trip. Get away for a while. That sounds nice, I replied, my voice steady, though my stomach turned. Where were you thinking? Maybe somewhere quiet. Somewhere without distractions. I forced a laugh. Like a honeymoon, he smiled. That practiced. Charming grin that used to melt me. Exactly like that. Later, when he left for his afternoon meeting, I went straight to his study. My hands still shook. But I worked quickly, searching for anything new. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of invoices, I found an envelope addressed to Evergreen Estate Management. I opened it carefully. Inside was a document titled Transfer Authorization, Client E. Hayes. My name again. My signature again. Only it wasn't mine. I scanned it quickly, taking photos with my phone. At the bottom, there was a date set for next week. The transfer was scheduled to finalize in 6 days. I closed everything and hurried upstairs, my mind racing. 6 days. That was all the time I had before everything I owned disappeared. That evening, while we ate dinner, he watched me over his glass of wine. I forced myself to smile, pretending nothing was wrong. He reached across the table, touching my hand. You've been quiet lately, he said. I hope you know you can trust me. The irony nearly made me choke. Of course, I said, smiling back. Always. That night, after he fell asleep, I hid my phone under my pillow and sent Clara the photos. She replied, minutes later, got them. This is solid evidence. You need a lawyer. I stared at her message, my heart pounding. I hadn't wanted to believe it had come to this. But now there was no other choice. The next morning, I drove to a small law firm near Green Lake. The brass plate outside read Grant Meyer and Associates. Grant had been a friend of my first husband's years ago. I hadn't seen him in over a decade, but I remembered him as honest, patient, someone I could trust. When I walked into his office, he looked up in surprise. Eleanor Hayes, he said, standing to shake my hand. It's been a long time. What brings you here? I sat down and handed him the photos. He studied them carefully, his expression darkening. This signature isn't yours. Is it? No. He nodded. I thought so. He leaned back, rubbing his chin. Do you know a man named David Reynolds? The name hit me like a slap. How do you know that name? Grant sighed. I used to work a case in Oregon a few years back. A man named David Reynolds was accused of scamming widows, marrying them, and draining their assets. The case was dropped when his wife supposedly died. He disappeared after that. My mouth went dry. Grant continued. If your husband Richard is really this man, we can alert the authorities, but we'll need concrete evidence tying the identities together. I opened my purse and pulled out the photos, the note from Emily, and the copies from Clara. Then I told him everything. Every detail. Every suspicion. He listened quietly, then said, You're in danger. Eleanor, If he realizes you know, he won't hesitate to silence you. What should I do? I whispered. He leaned forward. You need to play along until we have him. Pretend nothing's wrong. Gather proof. Record everything. I'll contact a friend in the bureau. The bureau. FBI. The word made me shiver. I nodded slowly. Okay. When I left his office, I felt lighter, though fear still sat in my chest like a stone. For the first time, I had an ally. That night, I came home and found Richard waiting in the living room. His face softened as he stood. You look tired. Long day, just errands, I said, setting my purse down. He smiled, brushing my shoulder as he passed. You work too hard. Ellie, I'm taking you somewhere special soon. Somewhere peaceful. I forced a small smile. That sounds wonderful. When he kissed my cheek, I smelled the faint trace of whiskey on his breath. He whispered, You'll see. Everything will be perfect soon. As he walked away, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Later that night, while pretending to read in bed, I heard him on the phone in his office. His voice was low. Calm. Too calm. Yes. She'll sign next week. No. She doesn't suspect a thing. I closed my book, heart hammering in my chest. He was talking about me. The next morning, I looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection stared back. Eyes hollow but steady. The woman I saw wasn't the naive wife who believed in fairy tales. She was someone else now. Someone ready to fight back. I woke up before dawn, staring at the ceiling, my mind already running through what I had to do. Every breath felt like a small countdown to something I couldn't quite see yet. I got dressed quietly and slipped downstairs. Richard was still asleep. Thank God. I needed time. And silence was my only ally. I made coffee, sat at the table, and replayed Grant's words in my head. Gather proof. Record everything. Pretend nothing's wrong. My hands trembled as I turned on my phone and opened the voice recorder. From that moment, every conversation with Richard would be evidence. When he came down later, he smiled like any ordinary husband would. Morning. Sweetheart, he said, pouring himself coffee. You were up early. Couldn't sleep. I said. I tried to sound casual, but my throat felt tight. He nodded. I sat down and opened the newspaper. For a few moments, we just sat there, like we used to. Then he looked up and said, We should finalize those documents next week. Get everything settled before our trip. What documents? I asked. Feigning confusion, he smiled. The way you'd smile at a child. The estate forms. Remember, for your peace of mind. Ah. Right. I said softly. My phone was recording, sitting innocently beside my cup of coffee. After he left for his meeting, I drove straight to the public library again. My hands were still shaking when I typed David Reynolds, Oregon into the search bar. The first result was an old newspaper article. I clicked it. It was about a woman named Laura Whitman, 64 years old, found dead in a psychiatric facility outside Portland. Her husband, David Reynolds, had vanished right after her death. Authorities suspected foul play but never proved it. My stomach turned as I stared at the picture. Laura had soft gray hair, kind eyes, and a gentle smile. She could have been me. The article said her nurse had reported signs of abuse before Laura's death. The nurse's name was Emily Carter. My breath caught in my throat. Emily. She'd known all along. She'd seen this before. I printed the article, folded it carefully, and tucked it into my purse. Then I called Grant from the library's parking lot. Grant. I found something, I said. A woman named Laura Whitman. He did this before. Grant's voice was grim. That matches what I heard from my contact. You're not his first. But now we have names. Records? A trail. "What do we do next?" I asked. "You keep playing along," he said. "We're coordinating with the Bureau. But they need him to act first. Once he moves the funds or tries to leave, we can arrest him. How long do I have? A few days at most." "Eleanor, don't be alone with him more than you have to." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I'll be careful." When I got home, Richard was in the garden, trimming the roses. He looked peaceful, almost tender. I watched him from the kitchen window, trying to reconcile that image with the monster I knew he was. For a moment, I wondered if he'd always been this way, or if something had twisted inside him over time. Then I remembered Laura Whitman's face and the way Emily's hands had trembled. No. He'd been this way all along. That night, he opened a bottle of wine and said, "To new beginnings." I forced a smile. "To us." We drank. And he talked about the future. About moving to Arizona. Starting over. His voice was smooth, confident. My skin crawled. I excused myself early, saying I felt tired. Upstairs, I locked the bathroom door, turned on the faucet, and whispered into my phone recorder. "He's planning to transfer the money in 3 days. He said he's taking me away afterward. Please, God, help me get through this." When I came out, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, waiting. "You've been acting strange." "Ellie," he said softly. "Is something wrong?" I shook my head. "Just nerves, I guess. So much happening." He stood and brushed a strand of hair from my face. "You know I only want what's best for you." "Right," I nodded, though every part of me screamed to pull away. He smiled faintly, then kissed my forehead. "You'll thank me when it's all over." When it's all over. Those words echoed in my head long after he fell asleep. The next morning, I drove back to Grant's office. He introduced me to a woman named Agent Lawson, who showed me her badge quickly before tucking it away. She said they'd been tracking David Reynolds for months but never had enough to convict. My evidence could change that. "We'll need your cooperation," she said gently. "We can't arrest him until he makes the financial transfer. That's our proof of intent. You want me to stay with him until then?" I said quietly. She nodded. "We'll keep eyes on you." But yes. I swallowed the fear rising in my throat. "I'll do it." That night, Richard came home with a bouquet of lilies, my favorite. He handed them to me with a smile. I thought we deserved something beautiful. They were perfect. Pure white. Their scent filling the room. I wanted to crush them under my heel. Instead, I placed them in a vase and said, "They're lovely. Thank you." We had dinner together, candlelight flickering between us. He reached across the table and held my hand, his thumb tracing slow circles against my skin. "You know," he said softly, "I think this next chapter of our life will be the happiest yet." I smiled faintly. "I hope so." After dinner, he suggested we go through the paperwork together tomorrow. I agreed, hiding my trembling hands in my lap. When he went to bed, I sat in the living room with the lights off, listening to the clock tick. Every second felt heavier than the one before. I knew what he was planning now. He was going to make me sign those papers, move the money, and disappear, just like he had with Laura. But this time, he wasn't going to vanish. I reached for my phone and sent a message to Grant. "He's transferring the funds tomorrow afternoon. I'll stall him as long as I can." Then I turned off the phone and stared at the dark window. My reflection stared back, pale but determined. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the end. When morning came, I barely felt human. My hands were cold. My heart beat loud in my ears. I went through the motions of making breakfast, frying eggs, pouring coffee, pretending like everything was fine. Richard sat across from me, calm as ever, reading the paper while I tried to keep my hands from shaking. He smiled without looking up. "Busy day today." I thought we could go over those forms before lunch. Sure, I said. My voice cracked on the word. He looked up briefly. Studying me. You okay? You look pale. Just didn't sleep much. He reached across the table and touched my wrist. His fingers cold. You should rest after we finish, he said softly. You've been overworking yourself lately. I pulled back gently and smiled. I'll be fine. After breakfast, I went upstairs to shower. I turned the water as hot as I could stand it and let the steam fill the room. It felt like the only place I could breathe. I watched my reflection blur in the mirror and whispered to myself, hold on. Just one more day. When I came downstairs, Richard had already set up the papers on the kitchen table. He had everything lined up perfectly. Every pen. Every page. It looked more like a business meeting than a marriage. He gestured for me to sit. These are just routine authorizations, he said. Transfers between our accounts. Nothing complicated. I nodded and sat down, pretending to read. My eyes scanned the lines without focusing. Every muscle in my body screaming. I needed him to believe I was complying. He leaned over my shoulder, pointing at a section near the bottom. That's where you sign. Right there. I held the pen, staring at the spot where my name was supposed to go. My hand trembled. Richard, I said carefully. Do you ever think about the future? He smiled faintly. Every day. That's why I'm doing this. So we can finally relax. I looked up at him. His eyes were soft, gentle, even. But I could see it now. The calculation behind them. It wasn't love. It was ownership. I signed the first page, hesitating on the second. My voice shook. I just want to make sure this doesn't affect my personal account. You know how anxious I get about finances. He chuckled. You worry too much. Ellie, I've got everything handled. I forced a smile. Of course you do. I signed the rest. But I used my left hand on the last page, slightly altering the signature. It wouldn't hold up in court. I hoped. When it was done, he gathered the papers neatly and slipped them into a folder. See, that wasn't so bad. No, I said softly. Not bad at all. He poured us both coffee and leaned back, looking satisfied. You'll thank me soon, he said. This is for both of us. I nodded, pretending to sip my drink while my mind raced. The recorder in my pocket had caught every word. Around noon, he went out to drop the papers off at Evergreen Estate. As soon as the door closed, I grabbed my phone and called Grant. He answered on the first ring. He brought the documents to Evergreen. I said, I signed them. But not cleanly. Grant's voice was calm. That's fine. The Bureau's already watching. Don't do anything to tip him off. If he suspects we're on to him, he'll run. What if he hurts me first? There was a pause. Keep a bag ready. Just in case. If things change, get to a public place and call me. I nodded, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles went white. Richard came back a few hours later. He seemed almost giddy. Everything's official now, he said, smiling wide. In a few days, we'll be done with the paperwork. Then we can leave this gloomy city. Where will we go? I asked. He tilted his head. Somewhere warm. Maybe Tucson. That night, he cooked dinner, humming while he moved around the kitchen. I could barely eat. My stomach felt like it was tied in knots. Every sound he made, every movement, felt deliberate, controlled. When we finished, he poured me another glass of wine. Drink, he said with a soft smile. You need to relax. I took a sip but didn't swallow. When he turned to rinse his plate, I spit it back into the napkin. My throat burned. Later, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. I could feel him beside me, breathing slow and steady. I couldn't tell if he was asleep or pretending. I stared into the darkness until the faint glow of morning began to seep through the blinds. The next day, I made an excuse to go grocery shopping. He offered to come. But I smiled and said I needed a little time alone. He hesitated, then nodded. At the store, I picked up only a few things. But my mind wasn't on groceries. I drove to a nearby cafe and sat in the corner with a notebook. I wrote down everything I knew, every detail I could remember, every account name, every conversation. I drew a timeline. Each line made me shake harder, but it also gave me strength. When I got home, Richard was standing in the doorway waiting for me. "You were gone a while," he said lightly. I held up the grocery bag. The lines were long. He stepped closer, brushing my cheek with his hand. "You know I worry when you're out too long." I smiled weakly. "You don't need to." He leaned in and kissed my forehead. "Still, I do." That night, he locked his office before coming to bed. I heard the click of the key turning and the faint sound of papers being moved. He didn't know I'd already taken photos of everything. Around midnight, I heard him leave the room. The floor creaked faintly. I waited, listening. The fridge door opened, then closed. When I finally stepped out, the hallway was empty. On his desk sat his phone, still unlocked. I hesitated, then opened his messages. My breath caught when I saw one from an unknown number. "All clear for transfer Friday. She's compliant." I took a photo and put the phone back exactly where it was. When I climbed back into bed, I lay stiff beside him, barely breathing. His arm slid over me, heavy and possessive. I closed my eyes and thought of Laura Whitman. I thought of Emily, the nurse who risked everything. I thought of the $200,000 that represented more than money. It was my life, my trust, my past, and I swore that before the end of this week, I'd take it all back. The clock on the nightstand ticked softly in the dark. Each second was a promise, counting down to the day he would fall. Friday arrived heavy with silence. Even the air in the house felt different, still and watchful. I woke before Richard and stood by the window, watching the fog drift over the yard. The world looked muted, like it was holding its breath. By 9, he was dressed and humming to himself as he packed his leather briefcase. I made coffee just to keep my hands busy. Every clink of the spoon against the cup made me flinch. He smiled as he came into the kitchen. "Big day, Ellie. Once this transfer is done, we're free. Can you imagine? No more worries. No more responsibilities." I forced a smile, setting the cup in front of him. "Sounds wonderful." He took a sip, his eyes lingering on me. "You'll come with me to the bank, won't you? It's better if you're there. Makes everything look official." "Of course," I said, though my stomach twisted. After he left the room, I slipped into the laundry closet and turned on my phone. Grant had sent one message that morning: "Agents in position. Stay calm. Keep him talking." I stared at the screen until my reflection blurred. Then I tucked the phone into my purse and whispered to myself, "You can do this." By noon, we were at Rainier Trust, the same place where Clara worked. Richard didn't notice the tension in my shoulders or the way I kept glancing toward her office. He was too busy adjusting his tie and checking his watch. Inside the meeting room, a man from the financial department greeted us politely. Richard did most of the talking. I nodded when I had to, pretending to understand the legal jargon he threw around so easily. When the manager left to make copies, I caught Clara's eyes through the glass wall. She gave the faintest nod. My pulse jumped. Richard leaned close, lowering his voice. "You're doing great, sweetheart. Just a few signatures, and we can start our new life." I smiled weakly. "Where exactly are we going?" he chuckled. "You'll see soon enough. Somewhere no one will find us." My skin crawled. The manager returned with the papers. Richard slid them across the table toward me. Sign here. Ellie. I took the pen slowly, my hand trembling. I looked at him. Really looked at him. The charming smile. The calm eyes. The practiced confidence. It was all a mask. As I bent over the paper, I said softly, "Funny thing about new beginnings. Sometimes they look a lot like endings." He frowned. What I signed. Then the door opened. Grant stepped inside first, followed by 2 agents in dark suits. One of them flashed a badge. FBI. Mr. Reynolds, you're under arrest for identity fraud, financial exploitation, and attempted homicide. Richard froze. His mouth fell open, but no sound came out. The manager stumbled back. Stunned, I stood slowly, feeling my knees shake. I half expected him to laugh, to play it off as some mistake. But when they pulled out the cuffs, his composure cracked. He turned to me, his voice sharp. "Ellie, what did you do?" I met his eyes. "I found out who you are," he lunged. But one of the agents grabbed him, forcing him to the ground. The briefcase spilled open, papers scattering like white feathers. Among them, I saw the fake IDs, the withdrawal slips, the plane tickets under a name I didn't recognize. As they read him his rights, he kept shouting my name. "Eleanor. Ellie. You don't understand. This isn't what it looks like." I stepped back until my shoulders hit the wall. My hands trembled, but I didn't cry. For the first time in months, I didn't feel afraid. When they took him out, the whole office fell silent. People stared. I just stood there, clutching my purse like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Clara came over and put a hand on my arm. "It's over," she said quietly. I shook my head. Not yet. Not until I know everything he took. Grant joined us, his expression firm but kind. "We'll get it all back. Eleanor. Every cent." He paused, lowering his voice. "But you need to rest. You've been through hell." I wanted to believe him, but part of me couldn't stop thinking of that notebook in the safe. The names. The other women. How many had never gotten this far? That night, the house felt haunted by his absence. His clothes still hung in the closet. His cologne lingered in the hallway. I sat on the bed and stared at the empty space beside me. The news reported his arrest the next morning. David Reynolds, alias Richard Hayes, suspected of defrauding multiple widows across 3 states. I watched the footage in silence as they showed his mugshot. The same man who used to bring me coffee in bed now looked like a stranger. My phone rang. It was Agent Lawson. "We've recovered most of your funds," she said. "But there's more. We found files in his computer linking him to several missing persons cases. Your statement helped open all of it." I sat there, numb. After we hung up, I went to the back porch. The morning air was cold. The world quiet except for the soft hum of traffic in the distance. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I should have felt free. But instead, I felt hollow. Betrayal leaves a strange kind of silence. It's not relief. It's absence. Still, somewhere inside, a flicker of strength remained. I had survived. I had stopped him. And as the sun rose higher, I realized something else. My story wasn't over yet. There were other victims. Other women who never got a warning note. If I could help even one of them, maybe all this pain would mean something. I went inside, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop. For the first time in months, I began to write. Not to escape. To remember. The cursor blinked on the screen. Waiting. My name is Eleanor Hayes. And this is how I found out the man I loved never existed. The first few weeks after Richard's arrest felt unreal. I moved through the days like a ghost, answering questions from lawyers and agents, signing documents, staring at screens that confirmed how thoroughly he had dismantled my life. They recovered most of my money. But what I lost wasn't just measured in dollars. One afternoon, I met with Grant at his office downtown. He handed me a thick folder filled with evidence: financial statements, travel records, photographs. Each one was another piece of the puzzle. Another reminder that the man I loved had been nothing but a performance. He wasn't just living under an alias. Grant said he had at least 5 identities in the last 20 years. Every one of them married an older woman. Every one of them ended with a disappearance or a mysterious death. My throat tightened. How many? We can confirm 3 before you. Grant replied quietly. But it's likely more. I closed the folder slowly. My hands felt numb. He reached across the desk. You stopped him. Eleanor. Because of you. He'll never hurt anyone else again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house, touching things that had once been ours. The framed photos, the worn quilt at the foot of the bed, the ceramic mug he'd bought me in Oregon. Everything looked the same. But nothing felt familiar. When I walked into the kitchen, I found a small card on the counter. It was from Clara. You were brave. Don't let him take more than he already has. I smiled faintly and set it next to the vase of dead lilies. The petals had turned brittle and brown. But I couldn't bring myself to throw them away. A few days later, Agent Lawson called. She wanted me to come in for a debrief. Her tone was gentle, but serious. There's something you need to hear directly from us, she said. When I arrived, she greeted me with a folder of her own. Inside were photos from Richard's computer, labeled with women's names and dates. Some I recognized from the articles I'd found. Others were strangers. We're reaching out to their families, Lawson explained. It's likely he was targeting women with similar backgrounds. Widows. Retirees. Women living alone. I stared at one photo for a long time. A woman in her 60s. Sitting on a park bench. Smiling shyly at the camera. She had kind eyes. Her name was Margaret Hale. What will happen to them? I asked softly. The families. We'll tell them the truth, Lawson said. And we'll tell them you're the reason they finally have answers. On the drive home, I pulled over at a small overlook and sat there until the sky turned pink. I had imagined that when this was over, I'd feel peace. But all I felt was exhaustion. Relief was still somewhere far away, waiting for me to catch up. The next morning, Clara stopped by with a box of pastries. I hadn't realized how much I missed simple kindness until that moment. She sat at my table like we'd known each other for years. You look better, she said gently. How are you holding up? I exhaled slowly. Some days I feel strong. Other days, I feel like a fool. You're not a fool, she said. You survived someone who made a career out of breaking people. I nodded, staring into my coffee. Do you ever think about how easy it is to miss the signs? How love makes you blind to what's right in front of you all the time? Clara said softly. But the way I see it, the people who love hardest also hurt deepest. Doesn't mean they're weak. It means they have something worth protecting. Her words settled in my chest like a warm blanket. That afternoon, I got a letter in the mail. It was from Richard's attorney. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a single handwritten note. Ellie, I never meant to hurt you. You were the only one who made me feel real. I crumpled it in my fist. For a moment, I thought I might cry. But then I laughed. A sharp, unexpected sound. He was still playing the same game. Even behind bars. I burned the letter in the sink, watching the paper curl into ash. Over the next few weeks, I started volunteering at a local senior center. It began with just a few hours helping with administrative work. But soon I was speaking to groups of women about financial safety, warning them about scams, manipulative partners, and the quiet ways abuse hides behind affection. After one session, a woman my age approached me in tears. Her name was Judith. She said her late husband's business partner had been pressuring her to sign over part of her inheritance. I told her what Grant had told me. Don't sign anything without a lawyer. Don't be afraid to ask for help. You're not crazy for wanting to protect yourself. Judith hugged me, crying softly. You saved me, she said. But the truth was, I was saving myself too. Every time I shared my story, the shame shrank a little more. Every time someone said thank you, the fear lost a little of its grip. By early spring, the house began to feel lighter. I replaced the wilted lilies with fresh daisies. I opened the curtains that had been closed for months. I even played music again. Something I hadn't done since before everything fell apart. Then one morning, as I was watering the plants, a letter arrived from the bureau. Richard had accepted a plea deal. 30 years in federal prison without parole. I folded the letter neatly and set it aside. There were no tears this time. Just a quiet finality, like a door closing behind me. That evening, I walked out to the porch and watched the sunset paint the sky gold. For the first time, I didn't feel haunted by his memory. I felt something else instead. Freedom. I poured myself a glass of wine and whispered to the empty yard. You didn't destroy me, Richard. You made me stronger. A soft breeze brushed my face, and I smiled faintly. For years, I had believed that starting over meant forgetting. Now, I understood that healing was remembering without pain. The world was quiet, but it didn't feel empty anymore. I went back inside, turned off the lights, and for the first time in months, slept through the night. A week later, I stood in front of the courthouse again, watching the sunlight hit its white stone columns. The same place where I'd once felt small now felt like a line between two lives. Reporters were gone. Lawyers had moved on to other cases. The story that had once consumed me had become yesterday's news. But for me, the echoes were still loud. Inside, the FBI had returned the last of my belongings. My jewelry. My documents. The keys to the storage unit he had rented under a fake name. I signed the final form and thanked the clerk before stepping outside. The air smelled faintly of rain. I hadn't realized how much lighter my chest felt until that moment. Clara met me at the cafe across the street. She waved when she saw me and smiled that warm, steady smile that had become one of the few things I trusted. You did it, she said as I sat down. It's really over now. I stirred my coffee, watching the milk swirl into the dark liquid. Is it ever really over? She tilted her head. Maybe not. But it's something close. We talked for an hour about ordinary things. Her daughter's new job. The stubborn leak in her kitchen ceiling. The new bakery that opened on Pine Street. For once, it felt good to talk about things that didn't carry the weight of betrayal. That night, I returned home and walked through the quiet house. It no longer felt haunted. It felt like mine again. The walls didn't whisper his lies anymore. They just stood there, waiting for me to decide what came next. I picked up my notebook from the desk, the one I had used to track every detail of his deception. The pages were filled with names, numbers, emotions scrawled in shaky handwriting. I turned to a clean page and wrote something new. Chapter 1: After the Lie. I didn't know yet what the rest of the book would be, but I knew I needed to tell the story in my own words. Not as a victim, but as a woman who rebuilt herself. The next morning, I received a call from a journalist named Dana who was writing an article about financial predators. She had seen my name in the court records and wanted to talk. I hesitated but then agreed. We met at the same cafe where I'd spoken with Clara. Dana was younger, maybe late 30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She set down a recorder and smiled politely. You don't have to answer anything that feels too personal, she said. I just want to understand how someone like him could hide for so long. Someone like him, I repeated quietly. You mean, someone who looked normal? She nodded. That's how he did it. He didn't steal by force. He stole by kindness, by pretending to understand, to listen. He made you feel seen. And by the time you realized what he really wanted, it was too late. Dana looked down, scribbling notes. Do you regret meeting him? I thought about that for a long time. I regret trusting him, I said. But I don't regret learning what I'm capable of. When we finished, she thanked me and promised to send me the article before it went public. As I walked home, I realized how strange it felt to say it all out loud again. Not as confession, but as closure. That weekend, I visited a small cabin near the coast, a place I hadn't been since before my husband died. The waves crashed against the rocks, steady and patient, like time itself. I sat by the window and listened to the ocean until the sound filled all the empty spaces inside me. There was a knock on the door late that afternoon. When I opened it, Clara stood there holding 2 mugs of hot chocolate. I figured you could use some company, she said with a grin. We sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky turned gold, then pink, then deep blue. I realized I hadn't watched a sunset with someone I trusted in years. You think you'll ever let someone new in? She asked gently. I smiled faintly. Maybe. But it won't be because I need them. It'll be because I want them there. That night, I dreamed of the nurse again. Emily. She was standing in the hospital hallway, holding that same folded note. He's not your husband. But this time, when she handed it to me, I didn't feel fear. I felt gratitude. The next morning, I wrote her a letter. I didn't know where to send it, but I wrote it anyway. You saved my life. Thank you for believing a stranger enough to take a risk. I hope one day I can do the same for someone else. Weeks passed. I started teaching a class at the senior center about fraud prevention. The women came in groups of 10 or 15, some widowed, some divorced, all wary but hopeful. I taught them how to read contracts, how to recognize manipulation, how to trust their instincts again. One afternoon, after class, a woman named Gloria stayed behind. She looked nervous. My new boyfriend wants me to open a joint account, she said softly. He says it's just for convenience. Does he rush you? I asked. Sometimes. Then it's not about convenience. It's about control. She nodded slowly. I guess I needed to hear someone say that out loud. That night, she emailed me. I broke it off. Thank you. As I read her message, tears welled in my eyes. It felt like a quiet victory, one I hadn't even realized I needed. By the time summer came, I had finished the first draft of my book. Grant read it and said it would help more people than I could imagine. I didn't write it for fame or forgiveness. I wrote it to remember that even after everything was stolen, something inside me had survived. Sometimes, in the evenings, I still walked through the garden, barefoot on the grass, listening to the crickets. The air would carry faint traces of the past, but it no longer hurt. I'd built something new from the ruins, something honest and strong, and for the first time in years, I was no longer waiting for the next betrayal. I was simply living. One afternoon, nearly a year after Richard's arrest, I was sorting through some old boxes in the attic when I found a photo album I hadn't seen in decades. Dust covered the leather cover, and the smell of old paper filled the air. As I flipped through it, I found pictures from my first marriage. Robert and I, laughing in our backyard. Our daughter Lily, splashing in the kiddie pool. My chest tightened. Those moments felt like they belonged to another lifetime. One, untouched by deceit. I sat down on the attic floor, running my hand over the faded photos. Losing Robert had been devastating, but what came after had nearly destroyed me. Yet somehow, I was still standing. Maybe that was the point. Maybe survival wasn't just luck. Maybe it was a choice you kept making, over and over again. Later that evening, Clara came by with groceries. She had become my closest friend, almost like a sister. She smiled when she saw the photo album open on the kitchen table. "You two looked happy," she said softly. "We were. Before everything changed." She placed a carton of milk in the fridge and turned to me. "You ever think about reconnecting with your daughter?" I froze for a second. Lily had moved to Seattle years ago. We hadn't spoken much since Robert's funeral. She blamed me for staying quiet too long, for letting myself fall apart. "I've thought about it every day," I said quietly. "But I don't know what I'd even say." "Say you miss her," Clara said simply. "It's a start." That night, I sat in front of my laptop for over an hour, staring at an empty email draft. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Every sentence I tried to type felt too heavy or too small. Finally, I just wrote, "Hi Lily. I hope you're well. I'd love to talk if you're ready." Then I hit send and immediately closed the computer. The next morning, I didn't check my inbox. I busied myself with errands, cleaning, even baking, just to keep my mind from spinning. It wasn't until after dinner that I finally opened my email again. There it was, a reply. "Hi Mom. I'd like that." I read the words over and over. Simple, short, but they felt like sunlight breaking through a storm. We arranged to meet at a park halfway between our cities. When I saw her walking toward me, I almost didn't recognize her. She was taller, more confident, her hair streaked with gray at the temples. She hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "You look good." "Mom, you too," I said, my throat tight. We sat on a bench overlooking the lake. The conversation started awkwardly. Small talk about the weather and her job. But after a while, the wall between us began to crumble. "I heard about everything," she said finally. "The news. The trial." I wanted to reach out, but I didn't know how. "I understand," I said softly. I wasn't easy to talk to back then. She looked down at her hands. "You didn't deserve any of it. You know what he did." For the first time, I didn't flinch at his mention. "Thank you," I said. We talked for hours until the sun dipped below the water. When she hugged me goodbye, she held on longer than I expected. As I watched her drive away, I realized that healing wasn't about forgetting or even forgiving. It was about reclaiming the pieces of yourself that someone tried to erase. In the following months, Lily started visiting on weekends. We cooked together, took walks, and talked late into the night about Robert, about life, about how pain changes people. Slowly, our bond began to mend. One afternoon, she handed me a folded flyer. It was for a support group for victims of financial and emotional abuse. "You should go," she said. "You'd be amazing there." I laughed softly. "I already spend half my time at the senior center." "This is different," she insisted. "These are women like you. Mom, they've been through hell, but they're trying to rebuild." So, I went. The first meeting was small. Just 5 women sitting in a circle in a church basement. They shared their stories, each one different but all painfully familiar. When it was my turn, I hesitated, then told them about Richard, about the lies, about the day I found the note. When I finished, one woman reached over and took my hand. "You're the reason I came," she said quietly. "I saw your story online. It made me realize I wasn't alone." Tears welled in my eyes. For so long, I had felt ashamed, as if his crimes were somehow my fault. But hearing those women speak, I realized how many others had lived through the same kind of quiet terror, and how many never got to tell their story. After the meeting, I walked out into the evening air and felt something shift inside me. For years, I had been defined by what was taken from me. Now, I was finally defining myself by what I had built back. A few weeks later, my book was published. It wasn't a bestseller, but it didn't need to be. I started receiving letters from women across the country. Some thanked me for helping them spot red flags. Others just wanted to share their pain with someone who understood. One letter stood out. It was from a woman named Anne in Arizona. She wrote, "I was about to marry a man I met online. After reading your story, I asked more questions. Turns out, he wasn't who he said he was. You saved me." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my drawer beside Emily's note. 2 warnings from 2 different worlds, both saving lives in their own way. As summer turned to fall, I found myself spending more time outside, tending the garden, hosting dinners with Clara and Lily. Sometimes, when the evening light fell across the kitchen just right, I'd catch my reflection in the window and barely recognize the woman looking back. She wasn't broken anymore. She was alive. One crisp October evening, as I sat on the porch sipping tea, I saw a car pull into the driveway. Lily stepped out, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I thought you might want this," she said, handing it to me. Inside was a framed photo of the 3 of us, Robert, me, and baby Lily standing in that same garden decades ago. The colors were faded, but the love was still clear. "It's perfect," I said, my voice trembling. She smiled. "I thought it belonged here again." As I set it on the mantel, I felt a strange peace settle over me. For years, that house had been filled with lies, but now it was filled with truth again. The wind outside rustled the trees, carrying the scent of autumn through the open window. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me. Life hadn't turned out the way I expected. But maybe it never does. What mattered was that I had survived it, rebuilt it, and found something real at the end of all the pain. The past no longer defined me. It had simply taught me how to begin again. The first frost came earlier than expected that year. I woke up one morning to find the garden covered in a thin layer of white, every petal and leaf glistening like glass. The air was crisp and sharp, carrying that clean scent that only winter brings. I stood by the kitchen window with my coffee, watching my breath fog the glass. And for a moment, everything felt still and peaceful. The phone rang, breaking the quiet. It was Grant. His voice was warm, almost cheerful. "Eleanor, I thought you'd want to know. The court denied Richard's appeal this morning. He's staying put." For a long moment, I didn't say anything. The news felt heavy, not because I was surprised, but because it marked the true end of something that had hovered like a shadow over my life. "Thank you, Grant," I finally said. "I appreciate you letting me know. You did the hard part." He replied, "Take care of yourself." After we hung up, I went outside and stood by the frozen flower beds. The sun was rising slowly, washing everything in pale gold. I felt the cold bite at my fingers, but I didn't move. The quiet was comforting in a way that words couldn't be. Later that day, Lily came over with her husband, Tom. He had been cautious around me at first, unsure of how to handle the pieces of my past. But lately, he'd become like a son. They brought groceries and laughter into the house, filling it with a kind of warmth I had forgotten existed. "Mom," Lily said as she stirred soup on the stove, "you should come with us for Thanksgiving this year. It'll be nice to have everyone together." I smiled, setting the table. "I think I'd like that." After lunch, while they were packing up, I caught Lily looking at the framed photo on the mantel again. Her eyes softened. "You've come a long way, Mom." I laughed quietly. "Haven't we both?" When they left, I sat on the couch with my blanket and looked around the house. It was no longer a place filled with ghosts. It was home again, still. There were moments when memories crept in uninvited. Late at night, When the wind pressed against the windows, I would remember his voice, the way he smiled before a lie. But those memories no longer broke me. They reminded me that I had survived. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to speak at a conference in Chicago. It was hosted by a nonprofit that helped victims of financial fraud and emotional abuse. They wanted me to share my story. The thought terrified me at first. But something inside whispered that it was time. On the day of the event, I stood backstage clutching my notes, my palms slick with sweat. The auditorium was full. Hundreds of faces waiting. When the host introduced me, I walked onto the stage and looked out at them. Mostly women. Some young, some my age, some older. Their eyes met mine with quiet strength. And suddenly I wasn't nervous anymore. I took a deep breath and began. My name is Eleanor Hayes. I was conned by the man I thought I'd grow old with. As I spoke, I watched them nod. Some wiping tears. Others leaning forward. I told them how it started. How I ignored the small warnings. How I lost nearly everything. And how I fought to get it back. But more than that, I told them how I found myself again. When I finished, the audience rose to their feet. The sound of their applause filled the room, echoing through me like a heartbeat. I had walked through fire and come out whole. Afterward, a woman approached me with trembling hands. She was maybe in her 60s, wearing a faded blue sweater. I almost didn't come today, she said softly. But hearing you talk made me realize I can still start over. I squeezed her hand. You can. You absolutely can. That night, back in my hotel room, I looked out over the city lights. The snow had started falling again, tiny flakes drifting against the window. For the first time in years, I felt calm, the kind of calm that comes when you stop running from your past and start walking toward your future. When I returned home, the house felt warmer somehow. Clara had stopped by to leave a small note on the kitchen counter. He can't hurt you anymore. Live your life, my friend. I smiled and tucked it into the drawer beside Emily's note and Anne's letter. A little collection of strength from the people who had helped me heal. That evening, I lit a candle by the window and poured myself a glass of red wine. The flicker of the flame danced across the room. Outside, the frost was forming again, painting the grass silver. I thought about how fragile life can be and how beautiful it is when you finally learn to protect it. As I sat there, the phone buzzed with a message from Lily. We're counting on you for pie duty. Don't back out. I laughed softly. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't scare me. It felt open, like the first page of a new story. I closed my eyes and whispered into the quiet room. I made it. The wind outside shifted, gentle against the house. And I thought maybe it was carrying the sound of the past away for good. Thanksgiving came bright and cold. The kind of morning where the air stung your cheeks and everything smelled faintly of wood smoke. I woke early to start the pie Lily had demanded, rolling out the dough in my kitchen as the radio hummed softly in the background. The house was filled with the warmth of cinnamon and butter. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the heaviness of what had been lost. I felt present. When Lily and Tom arrived, their laughter filled the space like sunlight. They brought too much food, as always, and Clara joined us an hour later with her famous green bean casserole. The table was crowded. The plates mismatched, but it was perfect. At one point during dinner, Lily raised her glass. To new beginnings, she said, her voice steady and bright. To peace, Clara added, smiling at me. I lifted my glass, meeting their eyes. To second chances. After we ate, we moved to the living room with coffee and pie. The fire crackled softly, and Tom began flipping through channels until he landed on an old holiday movie. I watched my daughter laugh, her head tilted back, and realized that the sound of her laughter was the most beautiful thing in the world. When everyone left that night, I stood at the door and watched the taillights fade down the road. The house was quiet again. But this time it wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. I cleaned up slowly, humming to myself, and then sat by the fire with a small notebook in my lap. It had been months since I'd written anything. I thought about all that had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the fear, and the small miracles that had carried me through. The nurse's warning, the detective's steady patience, Clara's friendship, my daughter's forgiveness. All of it had woven together to create a new kind of strength inside me. I began to write. Not about the pain, but about what came after. How life, even shattered, could still be beautiful. How survival wasn't about erasing the past but learning to live beside it without letting it rule you. When I finished the last sentence, I looked around the room. The photo of Robert and Lily sat on the mantel beside a new one from that afternoon. All of us smiling, our hands touching, our eyes bright. I whispered softly, "Thank you for everything that tried to break me and failed." Weeks later, I received an invitation from a publishing company in New York. They wanted to reprint my story, this time as part of a collection on resilience and recovery. I hesitated at first, unsure if I wanted to relive it all again. But then I remembered that woman in Chicago, the one who told me she almost didn't come. Maybe someone else needed to hear it too. By spring, the book was out. It wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every woman who had been deceived, every survivor who had been told to stay quiet. The letters poured in again. Not just from women this time, but from men, from children of victims, from people who had lived in silence for too long. Each letter was a reminder that healing spreads, one voice at a time. One afternoon, as I sat in the garden planting new flowers, a delivery truck pulled up. The driver handed me a small package with no return address. Inside was a postcard with a single line written in neat, familiar handwriting. "Thank you for not letting me become another name in his file." It was signed, simply, "Emily." I smiled, tears blurring my vision. The nurse who started it all was still out there, still fighting in her own way. I tucked the card into my notebook, beside the first letter I had ever written her, and whispered, "You saved me." That evening, I walked to the edge of the garden. The sunset painted everything in shades of amber and rose. The breeze carried the scent of the lilacs I had just planted. I thought of all the versions of myself that had existed within these same walls. The woman who trusted too easily, the one who broke, the one who rebuilt. They were all me. Every single one. As the sun dipped below the trees, I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. Not the kind that fades, but the kind that roots deep and stays. Life had come full circle. I turned off the porch light and stepped inside, leaving the window open so the cool evening air could drift through. The world outside was calm, the stars beginning to appear. And for once, I didn't feel the need to close the door against it. I poured a glass of wine, sat in my favorite chair, and let the silence wrap around me. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty anymore. It feels earned. I smiled to myself and whispered into the quiet, "My story isn't about revenge anymore. It's about freedom." If you've ever lost yourself to someone's lies, if you've ever felt small, if you've ever had to rebuild from nothing, I hope my story helps you remember this. You are never too old to start over, never too broken to begin again. Healing doesn't erase what hurt you, it transforms it. So stay, listen, share your story, because somewhere out there, another woman is waiting for a sign that it's not too late. And maybe, just maybe, that sign is you.